Hello, and thank you for participating in our Child Protection Training session. I'm Mark Whitworth, Member Care Team Leader for the International Mission Board. Over the past few years, it is my joy to work with hundreds of missionaries and short-term personnel who are committed to sharing the gospel around the world. God has used thousands of individuals to reach the nations in a world that desperately needs to hear the story of Jesus. While our mission is still the same, the world we live in is constantly changing. Over the years, instances of sexual abuse have become more prevalent, and in recent years, the victims of these occurrences have more commonly been children. The sexual abuse of children has become a tragic epidemic in our country and around the world. It is estimated that 1 of 4 girls and 1 out of every 6 boys will experience some form of sexual abuse by the age of 18. With these kinds of numbers, it is not difficult to understand that child abuse has affected every area of our society, including the greater mission community. In a recent survey of 600 missionary kids from several agencies, 42 of them said they had been sexually abused on the mission field. Our main purpose for this training video is first and foremost to protect children, but also to protect workers from false allegations, which ultimately protects ministry resources for accomplishing God's tasks for the nations. The International Mission Board is committed to protecting children. There's zero tolerance for any abusive act towards a child. While you may not be working directly with children on your mission trip, you will have contact with them in some settings. All personnel and short-term workers must be vigilant to ensure that child safety procedures are in place and followed. Our objectives for this video are to better acquaint everyone with the problem of child sexual abuse. We will look at 4 critical components to reduce the risk of child sexual abuse, which includes understanding how to respond to an allegation. Please pay close attention to the information in this training. We provided a listening guide with this video that you may find helpful, as well as additional information that further reinforces the topics we will cover. If you're meeting in a group, you may find it beneficial to talk as a team about the information you learn. We would also like to point out that this training discusses sensitive issues that may not be appropriate for those audiences under the age of 18. We encourage adult leadership to view the material before presenting it to a younger audience. The effects of child abuse can not only have lifelong consequences to the child, but also destroy the good name of a person or a church that may be falsely accused. It is our hope that this training will help you protect the children you interact with, as well as the future ministry of you and your team. Thank you for taking the time to view this training and for your role in making child protection a priority for the IMB.
I think there are several reasons why this type of training is important. One reason is just that all of us might face reality. We want to believe, and we do believe, that our communities are safe with other believers, and that these sorts of things don't happen and wouldn't happen in a Christian community. And unfortunately, knowing my story and the stories of others, I know that it does happen. And I believe that when adults, whether they're parents, people who work with children, or simply other adults in the community, are aware that these things could happen, then they may look at some of the behavior of those around them a little differently. And sometimes that may prevent someone from taking advantage of a young person because they realize that what they are doing is visible to others.
Child abuse is not a new problem in our world, but awareness of the problem and taking deliberate steps to prevent it is something that we can do to protect children. IMB policy defines and prohibits 2 types of abuse: physical abuse and sexual abuse. You can find complete definitions of these types of abuse in your learning guide, but for the purpose of this training, we will define physical abuse as any act that results in a non-accidental physical injury to a child. Physical abuse includes administering discipline to any child that is not your own using spanking or another form of corporal punishment. Child sexual abuse is defined as any contact or interaction with a child in order to use them for the sexual stimulation of another person. Our primary focus in this training will be on child sexual abuse. There are 2 types of sexual abuse: touching and non-touching abuse. Some children may not be aware that certain behaviors and activities are inappropriate if their abuser has developed a trust with them. Aside from inappropriate touching and sexual actions, abuse may take the form of verbal comments, obscene phone calls, exhibitionism, or allowing a child to witness a sexual activity or pornography. To fully understand the problem of child sexual abuse, we first need to identify the profile of a typical abuser. 85 to 90% of all sexual abuse takes place with someone the child knows or trusts. This could be an adult, family member, or another child. Since an abuser is usually someone who is known and trusted, it is hard to accept that he or she could possibly have abused a child. This trust factor is why it is so important to be educated about this serious threat and why it may be so difficult for a child to come forward and tell someone what has happened. Increasing your understanding of what abuse is and how abuses work reduces the risk and vulnerability of children around you. The effects of child sexual abuse are long-lasting. Many even struggle into adulthood. So it is critical that any child who has been abused gets help as soon as possible. Some effects are loss of childhood memories, loss of a healthy social contact, loss of identity and self-esteem, a loss of trust, and a loss in sexual maturity. Also, a child's ability to learn may become blocked, resulting in distraction and falling behind in learning. But the child is not the only one affected. Those around them are also affected. The impact of child abuse can be far-reaching. It results in victimized children, hurt families, not only the family of the child, but also the family of the perpetrator. Victimized children who don't receive any help are much more likely to become abusers themselves. This is a real tragedy, where some who have faced heartbreak go on to perpetuate the trend. Besides these impacts on children and families, abuse frequently results in emotional trauma to leaders who may be accused of not doing enough to prevent the abuse. Media coverage, workplace morale issues, shattered trust, and spiritual crisis are other effects of sexual abuse. The statistics surrounding child sexual abuse are staggering. More than 2 million cases of child abuse and neglect are reported each year. It is estimated that there are 60 million survivors of childhood sexual abuse in America today. 1 girl out of 4 and 1 boy out of 6 are sexually abused before the age of 18. 1 child out of 5 is solicited sexually while on the internet. Reported victims have been as young as 6 months of age. Nearly 70% of all reported sexual assaults occur to children under the age of 18. The incidence of sexual abuse peak between the ages of 8 and 12 years. The mission field is not immune from abuse. In a recent survey of 600 missionary kids from several agencies, 42 of them said they had been sexually abused on the mission field. When you and I were growing up, you probably remember this concept of stranger danger. That was a big emphasis, to be aware of strangers. That is still important, however, things have changed. 30 to 40% of victims are abused by a family member, someone who is known and trusted. Another 50% are abused by someone outside the family who they know and trust. Approximately 40% of child abuse victims are abused by older children they know. Therefore, that leaves only 10% of children who are abused by strangers. So, who are the safe and trusted people for your children overseas as well as the United States? Your children trust you to help them know who their safe people are. Many times, child sex offenders have more than one victim. Nearly 70% of offenders have between 1 and 9 victims, and at least 20% have 10 to 40 victims. Some offenders have up to 500 victims. There are 2 types of child molesters with multiple victims. Situational child molesters look for the perfect situation in which they can find a victim, such as places like churches or school dorms, where children frequently go. Preferential molesters look for a particular type of child, such as a child with blonde or brunette hair, or a certain eye color or build. It's important to know the profile behind many child molesters, but for the sake of a child that is being abused, it is equally critical that all parents, relatives, and anyone working with children know some of the physical, behavioral, and verbal signs of molestation that might exist if abuse is taking place. We have a list here of some physical signs of molestation. We're not saying that a child exhibiting these signs has been molested, but we are saying that these may be a signal of abuse. Common physical signs of sexual abuse are lacerations and bruises, nightmares, irritation, pain, or injury to the genital area, difficulty with urination, discomfort when sitting, torn or bloody underclothing, and then the more obvious signs of venereal disease or pregnancy. Again, there could be any number of reasons for these signs, but should any of these surface, it should raise a red flag and prompt you to look into whether there is an underlying problem. Just as there are common physical signs, experts have also identified common behavioral red flags that may indicate abuse. A child acting out sexual behavior, or a detailed and age-inappropriate understanding of sexual behavior is a major behavioral red flag. Young children do not know this information. These are learned behaviors that a child is exhibiting, and it should tell you that a child is getting this kind of behavior from somewhere. Children would have to have seen something, heard something, or had something happen to them. So this should be something that causes alarm and prompts you to further inquiry on your part. Anxiety towards certain events or people is another behavioral sign. A child suddenly becoming uncomfortable with physical touch or contact. A child suddenly displaying a role reversal and hyper concern for sibling is a red flag. For instance, when a child begins to act as a parent or protector of siblings, this behavior warrants some notice. If something has happened to the child, he or she may want to be protective of siblings. Or if it is something that has happened to a sibling, he may want to be protective so it does not happen again. Also, nervous or hostile behavior towards adults, or sexual self-consciousness. For instance, if a child has a desire to over or underclothe himself, a withdrawal from activities and friends, or behavioral extremes, such as a child who is overly withdrawn or overly aggressive. Also, an apprehension when other children cry, or an oversensitivity to those children around him. Again, just like the physical signs, these behavioral signs do not necessarily mean that abuse is the source, but they should cause you to take notice and get more information about the cause. The main thing to be aware of is a sudden shift in the child's behavior, especially if that behavior is any of the ones we have listed. Finally, anyone working with children should be aware and actively listen for verbal cues that might indicate a concern or inappropriate behavior. A verbal cue might be something like, "I don't like a particular worker." There may be many reasons why a child doesn't like a particular worker, but it does warrant the follow-up question, "Why don't you like this particular worker?" Other verbal signs that should raise concern are comments like, "A certain worker does things to me when we're alone," or "A worker fooled around with me." These are all verbal cues that should definitely raise concern. The best response to these kinds of statements is to ask further questions. Ask specific questions, but not questions that lead to the conversation. Let the child tell you in his or her own words. Again, just because a child shows one of these signs we've mentioned, it does not mean that child sexual abuse is the cause. But whether physical, behavioral, or verbal, these signs should raise a red flag and should cause you to look into the situation further. There are 4 critical components the International Mission Board has put into place and will faithfully use to ensure that children are kept safe. The first of these is carefully selecting and screening workers. The International Mission Board screens not only all missionaries and staff, but also requests all short-term mission team members go through a background screening process through their church or sending group and certify that they have done so before arriving on the field. The IMB provides resources on its website to help churches and mission teams complete this screening process. The second component for overseas workers is child protection training, just like this video you are now watching. The International Mission Board requests that everyone who travels overseas has training to learn about ways they can help ensure the safety of not only the children around them, but the ministry of the trip. These steps are intended not only to reduce the risk to children, but also to reduce exposure to false allegations against you. The third critical component the IMB has in place to protect children from abuse is worker supervision. We are all a part of this. Now that you're being trained, you will be able to provide mutual accountability and supervision for each other. When it comes to child protection, good supervision that will minimize risk to children is dependent on 3 factors. We must practice good behaviors that 1. Minimize isolation of children, 2. Maximize the accountability of those caring for children, and 3. Correct the imbalance of power and control that exists between adults and children. We will look at each of these 3 factors individually. We like to think about these factors in the form of a risk meter. In situations you may face overseas, always think of metering the risk in any given circumstances with children. The goal is to keep the risk meter as low as possible, not only for you, but for the sake of the children around you. The principle of isolation. The principle of isolation states that the risk increases as isolation increases, just as risk decreases as isolation decreases. We want to minimize isolation. The bottom line for this principle is that a child does not need to be alone with an adult. This situation is high on the risk meter. 4 factors affect the principles of isolation. First, the number of people present. The guideline here is the more people, the better. In any situation in which children are entrusted to the care of the IMB abides by the 2 or more rule. That means there should always be at least 2 adults working with children at all times. And by adult, we mean individuals over the age of 18. For children 12 or under, at least one of these 2 adults must be a woman. The 2-person rule reduces the risk of child molestation by minimizing isolation. It also protects you and others from false accusations by providing 2 adult witnesses to any situation that might occur. Except for advanced parental consent, it should be an extremely rare occasion for this rule to be broken. The time of the activity is another factor that affects isolation. This basically means daylight versus nighttime. Daylight is always lower on the risk meter. Next is the location of the activity. This means public areas versus private areas. The 2 or more rule comes into play here as well. It is much lower on the risk meter to have activities in an area that is open and easily seen by others. So, for example, a public playground is low on the risk meter, a private bedroom is high risk. The final factor that affects isolation is the actual physical arrangement of the situation. For instance, areas that are in the open, or rooms with adjoining doors or with windows, are places low on the risk meter. Also, just keeping the door open when you're in the room with children is a practice that will help lower the risk of the situation. Thinking through these 4 factors before you care for children will be very helpful to you in minimizing the risk of isolation. The principle of accountability is another factor that can help us keep our risk meter down. Risk increases as accountability decreases. In fact, most instances of abuse occur in situations where the abuser took advantage of a situation in which he or she had insufficient accountability to others. Again, those of you who have training can provide accountability to each other and to those who have not yet been trained. You can provide accountability by making sure everyone is abiding by the principles and guidelines provided in training. Help each other by pointing out possible situations that could increase risk. The more we hold each other accountable to principles like the 2 or more rule, the lower the risk. There are also standards of interaction that we can use to keep one another accountable and safe from false accusations. We need to think about how we should appropriately interact with children. Children do need appropriate touch, and appropriateness is age-specific. For instance, the principles you might use with a baby are very different from those you would use with a child who is 4 years of age or older. You definitely need to pick up and hold a baby, but that is not the case for a child who is mobile. You have to think about these things when you determine what is appropriate when interacting with children. The following are just a few examples. This is definitely not an exhaustive list, but we hope it is something that will help you begin to think as you make decisions about what is and is not appropriate. We can say that appropriate is letting a child lead you in showing what touch is acceptable to him or her. For instance, if a child wants to come up and hold your hand, then the child has led, rather than you reaching out and holding his hand. Be sensitive and pick up cues from the child. You may want to ask permission before touching a child. Also, touch non-vulnerable body parts such as shoulders, back, arms, and hands. Most all children love a high five or a pat on the back. These are appropriate places. However, you want to avoid excessive appropriate touch. We also have a list of inappropriate interaction with children. Again, this isn't a complete list, but it should get you thinking about some of the things that may be inappropriate in relation to children. Tickling or wrestling. We're not talking about being playful with your own child or showing affection in this kind of manner, but this behavior toward another person's child is inappropriate. You should not be sitting a child who is 4 years or older on your lap. This is inappropriate. You can have the child come and stand beside you. There are ways that you can direct the children in order to be more appropriate. Kissing a child who is not your own is not appropriate. Sometimes it can be hard to think of a kiss on a young child's head as inappropriate, but we are saying that this is not an appropriate action toward a child who is not your own. As mentioned before in our principle of isolation, taking children on isolated outings is not appropriate. And of course, using bad language, telling dirty jokes, or showing inappropriate pictures is absolutely not appropriate. Another way you can provide accountability is by heading off something before it happens. Many times perpetrators will target children and then groom them for sexual assault. Let's take a moment to discuss what this means. Perpetrators may be watching to target a certain situation or type of child. For instance, vulnerable children. Perpetrators have a keen eye in determining which children may be vulnerable. These children may be those who are unsupervised. Children without supervision are targeted since there is not an adult in close proximity. Also, children who are quiet in nature may be targeted. These may be less likely to say no assertively. Also, perpetrators may target by spending unusual amounts of time around children rather than adults. Of course, this does not mean that a person who does this is automatically a perpetrator. However, this is just another thing that you have to watch for and be aware of. You also want to watch for so-called grooming behaviors. Not personal grooming, rather actions to prepare a child for abuse. More specifically, grooming behaviors refer to actions deliberately taken to befriend children and establish a connection to lower their inhibitions in order to sexually abuse them. These behaviors may include activities that are legal in and of themselves, but later lead to sexual contact. For instance, someone taking an undue interest in a child or spending extra time alone to become a special friend is a red flag. Normally, an abuser won't move directly to inappropriate touching. There's generally a period of time when the abuser works to build a sense of security with his or her victim. An abuser tests physical, emotional, and behavioral boundaries as well as community norms. Once an abuser has built trust with a child, he or she may try to touch a child in a seemingly innocent way. He may hug or pat a child for extensive periods of time or hold a child on his lap. These behaviors should be red flags for parents and workers to watch for. Other grooming behaviors may be promising special favors or giving special attention to a child. Abusers may encourage a child to keep what they are doing a secret. For instance, don't tell your mom that we're going out for ice cream or spending time together. We want to teach children to never keep a secret and to always tell their parents. Hugging, kissing, or other types of physical contact are all grooming behaviors. Allowing a child to get away with inappropriate behavior and talking to a child about problems that would be normally discussed with adults are also grooming behaviors. The perpetrator could also make threats about others if a child tells. For instance, if you tell anyone, then something bad is going to happen to your little sister. Also, there might be a growing amount of time spent with a child. This too should raise awareness. Many times abusers are very skilled at gaining the trust of not only the child, but also those responsible for the child. They may use this as a tool to make sure that the child's parents will be less likely to believe any potential accusations. We don't wish to alarm you with this information to discourage normal and healthy friendships between children and adults, but we do want to create a deeper level of awareness and appropriate accountability, not only for the safety of your children, but also for your protection. The principle of power and control is also something we need to think about when we want to minimize risk. When there is an imbalance of power and control, risk increases. Here we need to recognize that simply because of size and maturity, there's a natural imbalance of power and control between an adult and a child. Good procedures designed to help protect a child will help address the imbalance. The two-person rule comes into play again here. A second adult charged with caring for a child can protect that child from the imbalance of power that would be present if just one adult were with that child. Another common instance in which good procedures can lower risk involves having bathroom procedures. Bathrooms are by nature isolated settings in which an adult can take advantage of power and control imbalance to abuse a child. To address this issue, we'd recommend that only women take children to the bathroom who are unable to go by themselves. A person should not accompany a child or children that are not his own to the bathroom without first notifying another adult caregiver, thereby providing accountability. Another frequently overlooked situation with an imbalance of power and control involves older children taking advantage of younger children. Remember we talked about how a perpetrator can also be an older child that victim knows and trusts? Sadly, between 25 and 40% of abuse cases involve an older child abusing a younger child. Some cases of older child abusers involve teenagers experimenting sexually. Others involve children who have themselves been abused and are now repeating this behavior. Whatever the reason, the frequency of such abuse calls for proactive steps. The best approach in this area is to ensure that adult supervision of activities between older and younger children and to ensure that such interaction occurs in public or other non-isolated settings. To sum up, worker supervision is key in the three principles we have talked about: minimizing isolation, maximizing accountability, and correcting imbalances of power and control will involve mainly you, as trained individuals, proactively taking measures to provide appropriate supervision and reduce risk. As part of your continuing accountability role to one another, we encourage you to continually evaluate how you are doing in ensuring child safety in your area. Evaluate situations with children to see if there are ways you can handle things better and minimize risk. A fourth and final component of the IMB's approach to keeping children safe is to ensure that sound procedures are in place for reporting and investigating of any allegations of abuse. Should you ever have the heartbreak of observing a possible incident of abuse or having listened to a child make an allegation or describe an incident that it may have been sexual abuse, we want you to have some tips on how to respond. First of all, the IMB, like all state governments, has a mandatory reporting policy. Therefore, the IMB requests that you take immediate steps to report any allegation or suspicion of abuse, confirmed or unconfirmed. Suspicions of abuse may be reported to your team leader, missionary leadership on the field, or the confidential hotline maintained by the IMB for this purpose. A hotline number is available in the International Mission Board policy information provided for you with this training in the event you need to report an incident. As you report the incident, you also want to respect confidentiality. Only those who need to be involved should be told. You want to report this only to people who can truly and should help. Every allegation of abuse will be investigated objectively. If a child comes to you, how should you handle yourself in a situation? You want to provide a caring response. You don't want to express disbelief or minimize the complaint or place blame. You want to focus on 3 points. First, focus on the fact that the complaint is being taken seriously. You want to do this age appropriately. To a younger child, you can say something like, "I hear you, and I'm so glad you told me. I'm going to get you help." That would be very important to hear. Second, the child needs to know that procedures do exist for such complaints, and they will be followed to ensure proper follow-through. There is a system in place that could be acted upon very quickly should something like this happen. Third, communicate that the IMB wants to extend care and support in whatever ways possible to the victim and the victim's family, and we are committed to doing this. When you think about how you would respond if a child comes to you to report a sexual abuse or some other behavior suggesting abuse, it is critical to avoid a response of denial. For instance, saying something like, "I can't believe it, this seems impossible. You're not making this up, are you?" is not what a child needs to hear. They need to be affirmed. A good response would be something like, "Thank you for telling me. I know how hard this must be for you. You've done the right thing." Also, it is important to avoid statements that minimize the nature of abuse. Saying something like, "I am very sorry about what happened. We want to help you in every way we can," is a good response. As opposed to, "It doesn't sound like much happened. Maybe you are overreacting." It's also important to avoid comments that shift blame and burden onto the victim. It would not be appropriate to say something like, "Why didn't you tell someone earlier? You should have tried to stop him." Instead say, "You've taken a courageous step today. I know this has been difficult, but you've done the right thing." It is so important for a child to hear this from you. Recognize that it is frequently an enormous step for an abused child to tell anyone, even the smallest part of abuse he or she has suffered. Because of manipulation by the abuser, that child may be feeling in some way responsible for what has happened to him or her. He may be blaming himself, or may have been told something that was bad was going to happen to him or a loved one if he tells. The child needs encouragement that he or she has done the right thing. All of these seem like common sense reactions, but if a child comes to you with information like this, particularly if the person accused is someone you know and trust, your shock may lead you to react in a way that is not good for the child. Be prepared to be supportive and get help.
In helping provide this training for other adults as an adult survivor of child sexual abuse, I reflected back on what was said to me when I came forward. And it was those very messages. And it was those messages that caused me to weep with relief. And those are certainly the messages that any of us may ever encounter that's experienced this should convey to a child or adult, a victim of sexual abuse.
When you talk to a child, be sensitive to confidentiality, but at the same time, stay in an environment that is not isolated. Take a child to the side in a public area so that you can talk and ask a few questions to give you clarity so that you'll know how to proceed in your reporting. You want to reassure the child that he or she is not in trouble. Again, the child has done the right thing by coming forward. Listen to the child and keep your feelings under control. This can be difficult, but you need to do this. Use the child's vocabulary. Words like allegation and perpetrator are probably not the best choice for this situation. Let the child know what you will do. For instance, say, I'm going to talk to people who can help us. I won't tell anyone who does not need to know, but we need to get someone who can help you. This is very important because many times a child may ask you to keep information a secret, and you cannot do that. You need to let the child know what you will do to help. Ask open-ended questions like who, where, when, what happened next, to communicate more details. Never ask leading questions which may put ideas into a child's head or confuse the situation. When talking with the child, do not press for details beyond what the child is willing to share with you. Remember, it is not your job to prove abuse. We have people and procedures in place who can take it from there. You just need to get the basic information and report this so we can begin to provide help. You can never promise confidentiality. You don't want to ask any leading or suggestive questions, and you don't want to make any angry or critical comments about the alleged perpetrator. You also don't want to disclose any information indiscriminately, keeping in mind the child's right to privacy. These are all so important when talking to the child. To conclude then, in this training we have looked at 4 critical components the IMB has put in place to reduce the risk of child sexual abuse. Through this material, our goal is to better acquaint you with the problem of child sexual abuse in order to protect the children around you, as well as to reduce the risk of false allegations. Written materials accompany this DVD, including the IMB's policy for responding to sexual abuse. We've also included a few recommended websites in these materials. They are places where you can find more information on how to keep children safe. If you are completing this training as a small group, we have also included in your materials a small group discussion guide. You are welcome to go through this together and based on what you've talked about, think through how you would respond in each situation. We have not intended to alarm you with this information, but we do want to create a deeper level of awareness for the safety of your children and also for your protection. Organizations known for taking child abuse seriously are the most successful in keeping away potential abusers and reducing abuse. Thank you for your attention during this training video. The International Mission Board has a firm commitment to keeping children safe, as well as protecting people from false accusations. It is our prayer that this training will help ensure the safety of children all over the world.